Welcome to my channel.
Chain in Lochdub did not fall so much as it drifted, a fine, grey hair that clung to the heather, and turned the peat-brown waters of the loch into a mirror of liquid lead. It was the kind of morning that invited a man to stay by the fire, and PC Hamish Macbeth was never one to decline such an invitation from Providence. Inside the police station, which was mostly a kitchen with a blue lamp, outside the air smelled of damp wool, wood smoke, and the rich, nutty aroma of coffee. Hamish sat in his sagging armchair, his long, lanky frame folded like a deck chair. At his feet lay Lugs, a dog of such indeterminate breed and spectacular ugliness that he appeared to have been assembled from the leftovers of several other animals. "It's a grand day for doing nothing, Lugs," Hamish murmured, peering through the steam of his mug. "DC Blair will be screaming for reports in Strathbane, but the Sutherland Road is probably a washout. A tragedy, truly." Hamish's red hair was a chaotic thicket, and his uniform tunic was missing a button, a casualty of a particularly enthusiastic poached salmon he had wrestled from the river the night before. He looked, to any passing tourist, like a man who struggled with the concept of linear thought. This was his greatest asset. In the Highlands, people tell secrets to the man they think is too lazy to write them down. The peace was shattered not by a siren, but by the aggressive, high-pitched whine of a high-performance engine. A silver Bentley, looking entirely too clean for the mud-spattered roads of Sutherland, lurched to a halt outside. Hamish sighed, a deep sound of mourning for his lost tranquility. He watched through the window as a man stepped out. The stranger was dressed in country attire that had clearly been purchased the previous week from a flagship store in Piccadilly. A tweed jacket so stiff, it looked like armour and +4s that made his legs look like two overstuffed sausages. "The new Laird of Ardnish Estate," Hamish muttered. "Sir Julian Vane. A man with a lot of money and a remarkable shortage of friends." Sir Julian didn't knock, he hammered. When Hamish finally opened the door, wearing an expression of vacant helpfulness, he was met with a face the colour of a ripe plum. "You, Constable!" Sir Julian barked. His accent was pure home counties, sharp enough to cut glass. "I've been calling the station for 20 minutes. Why weren't you at your post?" "I am at my post, sir," Hamish said softly, his Highland lilt lengthening the vowels. "The phone has a bit of a temperamental soul, the damp, you see." "Nonsense. It's incompetence," Vane snapped, stepping into the kitchen without an invitation. He wrinkled his nose at the smell of Lugs. "I am here to report a litany of crimes: poaching on my stretch of the river, locals trespassing on my private moor, and someone I suspect that ruffian who runs the local garage had the audacity to tell me to clear off when I told him to move his rusted scrap heaps." Hamish leaned against the dresser, looking sympathetic. "Aye, that would be Geordie. He has a very firm way with the English language. But as for the poaching, Sir Julian, the fish in the Highlands have a way of jumping into nets when no one is looking. It's a local phenomenon. It's theft." Vane slammed a gloved hand onto Hamish's scrubbed pine table. "I didn't buy a 5,000-acre estate to be mocked by peasants. I have invited several high-profile investors for a grouse shoot tomorrow. If I find one more local wandering on my land, I'll have your badge. Do you understand, Macbeth? Or do I need to speak to your superiors in Strathbane?" Hamish's eyes thinned for a fraction of a second, a spark of sharp intelligence behind the mask of the simple village bobby. The threat of Strathbane was a potent one. It meant DC Blair, and Blair was always looking for an excuse to ship Hamish off to a high-rise precinct in a city full of concrete and smog. "I hear you loud and clear, Sir Julian," Hamish said, his voice as smooth as a polished stone. "I shall certainly keep an eye out, see that you do. And for God's sake, man, buy a brush. You look like a hedge-backward scarecrow." With a final huff of indignation, the Sassenach Laird marched back to his Bentley, spraying a fresh coat of Lochdub mud over Hamish's doorstep as he sped away. Hamish watched him go, then looked down at Lugs. "He's a very rude man, Lugs. And in a village this small, being that rude is a very dangerous hobby. I wonder who will lose their patience with him first." He went back to his chair and picked up his coffee. It was cold. Now, Hamish was truly annoyed. Hamish was just reaching for the matches to relight his peat fire when Telephoneth one he had earlier claimed was temperamental and soulless, shrieked with startling, unwelcome clarity. He stared at the black device for a moment, hoping the caller might reconsider and find someone else to bother, but the ringing persisted with the doggedness of a hungry midge. With a heavy sigh and a muttered apology to Lugs, who had just found a comfortable spot on the rug, Hamish lifted the receiver. It was Archie McLean. the village's most prolific poacher and a man whose relationship with the truth was, at best, one of nodding acquaintance. Hamish, you'd best get up to the Ardnish boundary, near the old stone bridge. There's been a bit of a fashion disaster, Archie's voice crackled, sounding uncharacteristically thin. A fashion disaster, Archie? I'm a policeman, not a tailor, Hamish replied, his heart sinking as he looked at his cold coffee. It's the Sassenach, Sir Julian. He's not shouting anymore, Hamish, and he's wearing a very strange hat. 10 minutes later, Hamish was trudging up the muddy slope of the Ardnish estate, Lugs trotting behind with an air of professional boredom. The rain had turned into a steady, depressing drizzle that soaked through Hamish's uniform tunic, which was already lacking that essential button. He found Archie standing by a thicket of gorse, looking pale enough to blend into the mist. Sir Julian Vane was indeed near the old stone bridge, but he was no longer the arrogant figure who had pounded on Hamish's door. He was face down in a shallow, muddy ditch, and the sight was as bizarre as it was grim. A heavy, ornate iron starger, decorative garden ornament from the manor's grand driveway, had apparently fallen from the bridge above, pinning the laird into the muck. The stag's metal antlers were tangled in the back of Julian's expensive, stiff tweed jacket, making him look like he was being wrestled into the earth by a Victorian ghost. More humiliatingly, a bright pink private, no entry sign, which Julian had been seen aggressively hammering into the ground earlier that week, was wedged firmly under his chin like a grotesque bib. Dreadful, Hamish muttered, crouching down by the body. He didn't touch anything yet, but his eyes moved with a predatory sharpness that belied his slumped posture. He noted the way the mud was churned, the strange angle of the iron stag, and the fact that Sir Julian's brand new, handmade brogues were missing their laces. Is he? You know, Archie whispered, hovering several feet back. Aye, Archie. He's gone to that great private estate in the sky. Though I doubt they'll let him put up any trespassing signs there. Hamish stood up, his knees cracking in the silence. The annoyance of the situation began to settle over him like the hair. This wasn't just a death, it was a production. A murder in Lochdub meant the end of quiet nights by the stove. It meant the arrival of the great men from Strathbane. It meant the inevitable red-faced roar of DC Vars Blair. He looked up at the bridge. The iron stag was a massive thing. For it to simply topple at the exact moment the laird walked beneath was a coincidence that Hamish's skeptical Highland soul refused to swallow. He noticed a faint smudge of fresh grease on the bridge's stone parapet, and a strand of bright blue nylon twineth, kind used by local fishermen caught in a nearby windbush. Go back to the village, Archie, Hamish said, his voice losing its lazy lilt for a fleeting second. Tell Mrs. Wellington I'll be late for my tea, and tell Geordie at the garage to stay put. I have a feeling the air is about to get very thick with detectives who don't understand the difference between a Highland mist and a crime scene. Lugs let out a short, sharp bark, looking up at the ridge. Hamish followed the dog's gaze. Up on the heights, the mist swirled, momentarily revealing the silhouette of a figure, watching them from the cover of the pines. Before Hamish could even narrow his eyes, the shape vanished into the grey. He pulled out his notebook and a stubby, chewed pencil, his mind already cataloguing the villagers who had the strength to move an iron stag and the motive to see Sir Julian silenced. The wail of sirens began as a distant, discordant shriek, growing louder until it tore through the damp silence of the glen like a jagged blade. Hamish didn't need to look at his watch to know that the piece of Lochdub had officially expired. Within minutes, 3 police cars from Strathbane skidded to a halt on the verge, their tyres churning the soft peat into a muddy slurry. DC Vars Blair erupted from the lead vehicle before it had even fully settled, his face already an alarming shade of magenta that suggested his blood pressure was currently fighting a losing battle with his temper. Macbeth, Blair roared, his voice echoing off the crags. He marched toward the ditch, his cheap suit trousers instantly becoming soaked at the hem. Behind him trailed his usual entourage of detectives, looking like a flock of damp, miserable crows. What the hell have you done now? I leave you alone in this godforsaken heap of heather for 5 minutes, and you manage to let a member of the landed gentry get crushed by a lawn ornament. Hamish stood up slowly, wiping his muddy hands on a tuft of grass and adopting an expression of wide-eyed, vacant helpfulness. Good morning to you too, sir. It's a tragic business, surely. It seems the iron stag. I can see what it is, you Highland oaf, Blair snapped, peering down at the pinned body of Sir Julian. He let out a harsh, barking laugh that held no humour. A garden statue and a no-entry sign. It's local work. Some disgruntled peasant with a grudge against the English. Probably one of your friends from the pub. who didn't like being told to stop poaching. Blair spun around, his eyes landing on the retreating figure of Archie McLean, who was trying to vanish into the mist further down the path. "You, Detective Jimmy Anderson, go grab that one. He looks like he's got a guilty conscience written all over his scruffy face." "That's just Archie, sir," Hamish interjected mildly, his voice dropping into a slow, rhythmic drawl that always drove Blair to the brink of a stroke. "He was just the one who found the poor man. He's a sensitive soul, is Archie. The sight of a laird under a stag is a lot for a man to take before his breakfast. Sensitive soul. He's a vagrant," Blair spat. He turned back to the body, ignoring the subtle clues Hamish had been cataloguing. He didn't see the grease on the bridge, he didn't care about the missing shoelaces. It's an open-and-shoot case. Incitement of class warfare. Murder with a blunt object, specifically a heavy metal deer. We'll have a confession out of that poacher by nightfall. Hamish watched as Jimmy Anderson dutifully chased after the panicked Archie. He felt a pang of sympathy for his friend, but he knew better than to interfere when Blair was in a law and order frenzy. Instead, Hamish leaned down to pat Lugs, who was currently sniffing Blair's polished shoes with deep suspicion. "Careful, Lugs," Hamish whispered. "The inspector is in a delicate mood. Get that mongrel away from me, Macbeth," Blair bellowed, kicking out half-heartedly at the dog. "And get yourself out of my sight. You're sidelined. This is a Strathbane operation now. Go back to your kitchen and play with your knitting or whatever it is you do when you're not being a total embarrassment to the force. Try, if I see you poking your ginger head into this investigation, I'll have you transferred to a traffic beat in Glasgow so fast your kilt will spin." Hamish nodded submissively, his eyes cast down toward the mud. "As you say, sir. I'll just be staying out of the way then. A quiet day at the station is just what I was hoping for." But as Hamish turned to lead Lugs away, his mind was already moving far faster than Blair's heavy-handed assumptions. He knew that the Iron Stag didn't just walk to the edge of the bridge and jump, and he knew that Archie McLean didn't have the stomach for a murder this theatrical. As he walked, he felt the weight of the little piece of blue nylon twine he had pocketed. He needed to find a place where he could think, a place where the gossip flowed as freely as the tea, and where the real secrets of Ardnish estate were buried far deeper than a body in a ditch. He headed toward the village, his pace leisurely and his shoulders slumped in feigned defeat, knowing full well that Blair would spend the afternoon bullying the wrong people, while the real killer watched from the safety of the Highlands. Hamish Macbeth did not walk with the hurried gait of a man under pressure. He drifted with the aimless precision of a cloud caught in a Highland glen, his long legs eating up the miles of peat and heather without apparent effort. Lugs trotted beside him, his mismatched ears flapping in the damp breeze, looking every bit as disgruntled as a dog whose morning nap had been interrupted by a homicide. Behind them, the blue and white tape of the crime scene was being lashed by the rain, and the muffled shouts of DCY Blair provided a discordant soundtrack to the otherwise majestic silence of the mountains. Hamish knew he had been officially banished, but in the Highlands, banishment was merely another word for freedom. Blair would spend the next few hours stomping through the mud, destroying evidence with his heavy boots and terrifying the local sheep, while the real clues would be found exactly where they always were, in the warm, steam-filled kitchens and the low-lit bars of Lochdub. The village appeared through the Har like a ghost town, the whitewashed cottages huddled together against the encroaching grey of the loch. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, but they kept it locked away like a fine malt whiskey, only brought out for the right person and at the right time. Hamish made his way toward the Tommel Castle Hotel, a grand, crumbling edifice that sat on the edge of the village, catering to the kind of tourists who enjoyed a bit of faded glory and the occasional drafty window. He wasn't looking for a room, nor was he looking for a witness statement. He was looking for a pot of tea and the sharp tongue of Mrs. Gillespie, the hotel's long-standing cook and the unofficial curator of every scandal within a 50-mile radius. Entering the hotel through the back kitchen door, Hamish was greeted by the glorious, enveloping heat of a commercial stove and the scent of roasting lamb. Mrs. Gillespie, a woman whose face was as lined as a topographical map of the Cairngorms, didn't even look up from the potatoes she was peeling with lethal efficiency. "I heard the Sassenach is dead," she said, her voice a gravelly rasp that could have stripped paint, crushed by his own vanity, from what Archie McLean was shouting at the post office before the police dragged him off. "It was a metal stag, Mrs. Gillespie," Hamish corrected gently, folding himself into a wooden chair by the warmth of the range. Lugs immediately collapsed under the table, letting out a long, theatrical sigh, a decorative piece of ironwork. It seems Sir Julian didn't have the best of luck with his garden ornaments. Luck has nothing to do with it, Macbeth, she snapped, finally looking at him. She saw the missing button on his tunic and the dampness of his hair, and with a grunt of disapproval, she poured a mug of tea so dark it looked like engine oil and pushed it across the table. He was a man who went looking for trouble and was surprised when he found it. Did you know he tried to ban the locals from the old Kirk path, claimed it was private property? My own grandmother walked that path every Sunday of her life, and that man thought a piece of paper from a London lawyer could stop a Highlander's feet. Hamish took a long, appreciative sip of the tea, feeling the warmth spread through his lanky frame. He mentioned trespassing when he came to see me this morning. He was a very angry man, Mrs. Gillespie. But anger alone does not usually make iron stags fall off bridges. The cook leaned in, her eyes narrowing until they were nothing more than dark slits. He was more than angry. He was desperate. They say the Ardnish estate was bought with money that didn't exist. There's a rumour, and mind you, it's only a whisper from the girls who clean the rooms, that he was planning to sell the entire moor to a Dutch development firm. They wanted to put up 50 of those spinning wind turbines right on the ridge, where the golden eagles nest. He was going to turn our glen into an industrial park for the sake of a few £1,000,000 to pay off his London debts. Hamish paused, the mug halfway to his lips. Wind turbines, on the Ardnish Ridge. That would have ruined the stalking and the fishing for everyone. Not to mention the view for the whole village. Exactly, Mrs. Gillespie said, returning to her potatoes with renewed vigour. He had no love for the land, only for the profit. And he wasn't just bullying the locals. He was at the throat of his own secretary, a quiet little thing called Mary Spence. She's been staying at the hotel because she couldn't stand being in the manor house with him. Apparently, he hadn't paid her in 3 months, and when she asked for her wages, he threatened to have her blacklisted from every agency in the UK. He was a small man with a big title, Hamish, the kind who enjoys pulling the wings off flies. Hamish digested this information with the same slow deliberation he used for his tea. A bankrupt laird, a threatened secretary, a village whose heritage was about to be sold to the highest bidder, and a metal stag that had remarkably good timing. It was a potent brew. He thought of the blue nylon twine in his pocket. It was the kind of string used to tie down heavy loads, or perhaps, to trigger a release mechanism from a distance. And where is this Mary Spence now? Hamish asked quietly. Up in room 4, weeping into her pillows, I expect, Mrs. Gillespie replied. But she's not the only one who had a reason to see Julian Vane meet his maker. You should talk to Geordie at the garage. Sir Julian tried to have his business evicted last week. Said the sight of the rusted cars was lowering the property value of the estate. Geordie told him he'd see him in hell first. He seems to have reached his destination a bit ahead of schedule then, Hamish murmured. He finished his tea and stood up, feeling the gears of his mind finally beginning to mesh. The mooching had been productive. Blair would still be shouting at Archie MacLean, trying to force a confession out of a man who wouldn't kill a fly unless it was poaching his own beer, while the real motives were clustering around the village like crows on a fence. Hamish knew he needed to see Mary Spence, but he also needed to see Geordie. In Lochdub, a grudge was like a peat fire. It could smoulder for years underground, before suddenly bursting into a blaze that consumed everything in its path. He whistled for Lugs, who emerged from under the table with a piece of stolen potato in his mouth. Thank you for the tea, Mrs. Gillespie, Hamish said, reaching for his cap. It's cleared my head remarkably. Just see that you catch the right one, Macbeth, she called after him, as he headed for the door. Blair would arrest the lock itself if he thought he could handcuff the water. We need a man with eyes, not just a loud voice. Hamish stepped back out into the drizzle, the weight of the investigation now firmly on his shoulders. The lazy policeman was gone, replaced by the man who saw the things others ignored. He began to walk toward the garage, his mind playing back the scene at the bridge, the grease, the twine, and the missing shoelaces. There was a pattern emerging, a dark Highland tapestry woven from greed and old-fashioned spite, and Hamish Macbeth was the only one with the patience to unpick the threads. He knew that the killer was likely watching even now, hidden behind a lace curtain or a stand of pine trees. Confident that the stupid village bobby was no threat, it was a mistake many people had made before, and it was usually the last one they ever made in Lochdub. The path to the garage was slick with mud, the kind of footing that required a man to pay attention to every step. Hamish didn't mind. He liked the slow pace. It gave him time to think about the wind turbines, the bankrupt laird, and the secretary who had been pushed too far. As he approached the rusted gates of the garage, the smell of oil and old iron greeted him, a sharp contrast to the heather-scented air of the moor. He could hear the rhythmic clanging of a hammer against metal. Geordie was working, or perhaps he was just letting off steam. Either way, the conversation was bound to be enlightening. Hamish adjusted his cap, took a deep breath of the cold, damp air, and prepared himself for the next piece of the puzzle. The game was afoot, though in Hamish's case, it was more of a slow, deliberate stalk through the undergrowth of human misery. Hamish left the oil-streaked yard of Geordie's garage, with the rhythmic clanging of a hammer still ringing in his ears, a sound that seemed to mock the steady, soft patter of the rain against his peak cap. Geordie had been less than helpful, his face a mask of grease-stained indifference, though the way his eyes had flickered when the Iron Stag was mentioned suggested a satisfaction that was hard to hide. As Hamish navigated the expanding puddles, lugs trotting with a damp, dejected air behind him, the silver glint of a well-maintained Volvo caught the grey light of the afternoon. It was a vehicle that didn't belong in the mud of a Highlands winter, yet it was as familiar to Hamish as his own reflection in a peat-stained pool. Car slowed, the window gliding down with a hum of expensive engineering to reveal the porcelain-perfect features of Priscilla Halberton Smythe. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a practical but elegant clip, and her blue eyes, usually as cool as the loch in January, held a flicker of something that might have been concern. Hamish felt that familiar, dull ache in his chest, the one that reminded him he was a village policeman with a hole in his sweater, and she was the daughter of a colonel, destined for a world of London galas and men who didn't poach salmon for their supper. "You look like a drowned rat, Hamish," Priscilla said, her voice like silk over gravel, "and I hear you've been officially replaced by a man whose face matches the colour of his siren. My father says DCI Blair is currently making a nuisance of himself at the hotel bar, demanding to know the whereabouts of every able-bodied man in the village. He is quite convinced that a local rebellion is underway, and that you are likely the one leading it from the shadows." Hamish leaned against the damp doorframe of the car, ignoring the way the rain began to seep into his collar and down his neck. "Blair is a man who likes his villains to be obvious and his paperwork to be tidy. Unfortunately for him, Lockstub is rarely either of those things. I don't suppose you've had the pleasure of Sir Julian's company lately, Priscilla. He seemed very keen on his social standing before he was flattened by a garden ornament. He was in my kitchen this morning, shouting about poaching and threatening to have me sent to the darkest corners of Glasgow." Priscilla sighed, her gaze drifting toward the mist-covered peaks that ringed the loch. He was a boor, Hamish, a loud, posturing boor who thought that a title and a few thousand acres made him a king of the glen. He spent most of last week's dinner party at the castle, trying to convince my father to invest in some obscure land development scheme. But it wasn't just my father he was pestering. There was a woman with Hema Lady Diana Vane, a cousin by marriage, I think. She looked as though she had stepped out of a Mayfair salon and found herself in a muddy nightmare. She was furious with him, Hamish. I heard them arguing in the hallway about a family trust. She called him a penniless charlatan and told him that if he didn't pay her back by Friday, she would ensure he never stepped foot in a London club again. It was all very dramatic and quite un-Highland. Hamish tucked that piece of information away in the back of his mind, right next to the blue nylon twine he had found earlier. A penniless charlatan, you say? That would certainly explain the wind turbines. A man with a deep pocket doesn't usually try to sell his view to a Dutch firm. Did she seem the type to move heavy ironwork, Priscilla? Or perhaps she had someone to do the heavy lifting for her? Priscilla laughed, a short, brittle sound. Lady Diana? She wouldn't move a cushion if there wasn't a servant to do it for her. But she had a driver with him, a massive man, who looked like he had been carved out of a granite quarry. He didn't say a word the entire evening, just stood by the door looking like a looming threat. Julian seemed terrified of him. Whenever the man looked his way, Julian would start sweating and stuttering about his investments coming through. She paused, her eyes searching Hamish's face with an intensity that made him shift his weight. But there's something else, Hamish. Something odd. Julian this morning, just an hour before he died. He was walking toward the bridge, and he was in a state of absolute panic. He wasn't even wearing his shoes properly. One of them was flapping loose as if he had dressed in a desperate hurry. "Missing laces," Hamish whispered, more to himself than to her. The brogues in the ditch did not have any laces at all. I thought perhaps the killer had taken them as a trophy, or to bind his hands, but if he was already missing them when he left the house, he was a man obsessed with his appearance, Priscilla added, her tone turning serious. He wouldn't have walked a yard in public with loose laces, unless he was running for his life. He was being hunted, Hamish. I could see it in the way he kept looking over his shoulder. He wasn't just an arrogant Sassenach being bullied by locals. He was a man who knew the axe was about to fall. He looked pathetic, really. All that money and no peace of mind. Hamish stood up straight, his mind racing. The social dynamics of the upper class were always a labyrinth, but Priscilla had a way of pointing out the one door he had missed. Julian was not just an outsider being rejected by the village, he was a fraud being pursued by his own world. The Iron Stag was not a local's protest. It was a cold, calculated execution disguised as a Highland accident. It required strength, timing, and a complete lack of mercy. "Thank you, Priscilla," Hamish said, his voice soft. "You've given me more to chew on than a bowl of Mrs. Gillespie's stew. You should get home. The roads are going to be crawling with Blair's men, and they aren't known for their polite manners when they're frustrated." "And what about you, Hamish?" she asked, her hand hovering over the gear stick. "Are you going to let Blair take the fall for arresting poor Archie? Or are you going to do something about it?" "I'm just a lazy village bobby, Priscilla," Hamish replied with a faint, enigmatic smile. "I'll just be mooching about, looking for a bit of warmth. But if I happen to stumble across the truth while I'm at it, I suppose I'll have to mention it to someone." Eventually, he watched the Volvo disappear into the grey curtain of the rain, the red taillights fading like dying embers. The romantic complication of his life was as unresolved as ever, but the case of the dead Laird was finally beginning to take shape. He wasn't looking for a disgruntled poacher anymore. He was looking for a man in a Mayfair suit who knew how to tie a knot with nylon twine and how to make a family debt disappear in a muddy ditch. He whistled for Lugs, who was currently investigating a discarded crisp packet, and began the long walk toward the hotel. He needed to find Mary Spence, the secretary. If Julian was a fraud, she was the one who held the books, and perhaps the key to why a man would be running through the Highlands with no laces in his shoes. The darkness was closing in, and in Lochdub, the night held more secrets than the day could ever hope to reveal. He checked his watch. It was nearly time for the village to close ranks, and he needed to be inside that circle before Blair shut it down. The walk back to the village was a long, meditative journey through the deepening gloom, the kind of trek that allowed Hamish Macbeth to rearrange the fragments of the day like pieces of a broken stained-glass window. The drizzle had turned into a steady, rhythmic drumming against his shoulders, and the air was thick with the scent of wet bracken and the sharp, salty tang of the loch. As he approached the police station, the sight of DC the Far's car parked crookedly on the verge, its engine still ticking as it cooled, told him that the great man from Strathbane was in no mood for Highland subtleties. Hamish felt a weary tighten in his chest, knowing that the sanctuary of his kitchen had been invaded by the scent of cheap tobacco and the loud, abrasive presence of a man who viewed the locals as little more than statistics in a crime ledger. Lugs seemed to share his sentiment, trailing a few paces behind with his tail tucked low, his mismatched eyes reflecting the yellow glow from the station's windows. When Hamish pushed open the door, he was met by a wall of heat and the sound of Blair's voice, which was currently pitched at a level somewhere between a foghorn and a circular saw. Archie McLean was sitting on a hard wooden chair, looking smaller than usual, his face pale, and his hands trembling as he clutched a cap that had seen far better decades. Blair was looming over him, his face a vivid shade of purple that clashed horribly with the orange peel scattered across the table. "I've got you, you little Highland rat!" Blair screamed, slamming a fist down on the pine surface. "We found the rope, didn't we? A coil of heavy-duty hemp, hidden right under the floorboards of your shed. It's the same weight that could have triggered that Iron Stag. You hated him, didn't you? Hated him for blocking your path. Hated him for being a gentleman. You thought you'd play a bit of Braveheart, and now you're going to rot in a cell for it." Hamish didn't say a word at first. He simply walked to the stove, took the lid off the kettle, and checked the water level with an air of profound detachment. She looked like a man who was more concerned with his next cup of tea than with a murder investigation, a performance that never failed to aggravate Blair's already precarious blood pressure. "Macbeth," the DCI bellowed, spinning around. "Don't you dare start making a brew. I've just solved your case for you. I've got the motive, I've got the means, and I've got the man. Anderson is outside right now, processing the rope we took from this vagrant's hovel. It's an open and shut case. You can go back to your poaching and your pathetic little dog." Hamish sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of the entire glen. He turned slowly, leaning against the dresser, with his arms folded over his damp tunic. "It's a fine piece of rope, I'm sure, sir," he said, his voice drifting into a slow, melodic drawl that seemed to suck the oxygen out of Blair's fury. "But Archie here is a man who treats a rope like a sacred relic. He uses it for his nets and his snares. He wouldn't dream of leaving it in a muddy ditch under a metal deer. It would ruin the fibers, you see." Archie is very particular about his fibers. I don't care about his fibers, Blair roared. He's the only one who was there. He's the one who reported it. That's the oldest trick in the book, Macbeth. The killer always wants to be the one to find the body so he can play the concerned citizen. Aye, that is true enough in the city, I suppose, Hamish replied mildly, his eyes shifting to Archie, who was looking at him with the desperation of a drowning man. But there's a small matter of the shoes, Sir Julian's shoes. You see, when I was looking at the body in the ditch, I noticed something that didn't quite sit right with my soul. The brogues were brand new, very expensive, but they had no laces. Julian was a man of immense vanity. Priscilla Halberton-Smythe saw him running toward that bridge earlier this morning, and she noted that his laces were flapping, but when he was found, the laces were gone entirely. Not just loose, sir, but removed. Blair scoffed, though the purple hue of his face receded just a fraction. So what? Maybe they fell out in the mud. Or maybe this little rat took them because he's a thief as well as a murderer. Archie has many faults, but he wouldn't know what to do with a pair of handmade silk laces, Hamish said, stepping closer to the table. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small piece of blue nylon twine he had found on the bridge. This twine, sir, is what was actually used to tip the stag. It's fisherman's twine, very strong, very thin. But here is the problem for your theory. To use this twine to pull that stag from the bridge, you'd need to be standing in the tree line, nearly 50 yards away. Archie was seen by Mrs. Wellington at the post office at exactly 9:10. Sir Julian's watch, which was smashed in the fall, stopped at 9:15. Archie would have had to run 3 miles through the peat bog in 5 minutes to set that trap, and then be there to find the body. Even a Highland lad isn't that fast, sir. Not unless he had wings. Blair looked from the twine to Archie, then back to Hamish, his eyes narrowing. You're making this up to protect your friend. You've always been soft on the locals. And then there is the grease, Hamish continued, ignoring the insult. There was fresh industrial grease on the bridge parapet. The kind they use for heavy machinery or for the hinges of a large gate. Archie doesn't own any heavy machinery. He doesn't even own a lawnmower that works. Cardnish estate has plenty of it. And Sir Julian was running, sir. He wasn't walking to his death, he was fleeing. He had no laces because someone had already tried to bind him, or perhaps he had stripped them to use for something else in his panic. If Archie had been the one chasing him, Julian would have just turned around and knocked him over. Julian was a big man, and Archie is mostly made of hope and old wool. The silence in the kitchen became heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant, lonely cry of a curlew out on the moor. Blair looked at the rope on the table, which suddenly seemed like a very flimsy piece of evidence indeed. He let out a low, dangerous growl, his ego bruised, but his stubbornness still intact. Fine. Let the little rat go. But if I find out you're leading me on a wild goose chase, Macbeth, I'll have your hide. Who was he running from then, if it wasn't the local poacher? Hamish looked toward the window, where the darkness had finally swallowed the loch. He was running from his own world, sir. A world of debts and angry cousins, and men who don't care about the Highlands. I think it's time we stopped looking at the people who hated him, and started looking at the people who owned him. As Archie scrambled out of the station with a whispered word of thanks, Hamish turned back to the kettle. The obvious suspect was clear, but the real hunt was only just beginning, and it was leading away from the village, and toward the cold, dark heart of the Ardnish estate. The departure of D.C. Blair was like the passing of a localized thunderstorm. The air in the kitchen felt suddenly lighter, though the smell of his acrid tobacco smoke lingered like a bad memory. Hamish stood by the window, watching the taillights of the police cars disappear into the veil of the rain. Knowing he had only a short reprieve before the DCI returned with a fresh appetite for an arrest. He knew he had to move quickly, or rather, as quickly as a man of his deceptive indolence ever moved. Luggs sat by the door, his tail thumping a rhythmic thud-thud against the floorboards, waiting for the evening walk that had been so rudely postponed. Patience, Luggs, Hamish murmured, reaching for his heavy waterproof coat. There is a lady in distress at the hotel, and I have a feeling she holds the thread that will unravel this entire tapestry of lies. He stepped out into the night, the Highland darkness pressing in from the mountains, turning the village into a cluster of dim, orange-lit windows floating in a sea of ink. The walk to the Tommel Castle Hotel took him past the silent harbour, where the boats bobbed like sleeping birds on the black water, their masts creaking a lonely chorus in the wind. Inside the hotel, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of damp wool and the low hum of village speculation. Hamish avoided the main bar, where the locals were likely dissecting the murder with the surgical precision of amateur pathologists, and made his way up the creaking staircase to room 4. He knocked softly, a sound that seemed to echo through the drafty corridor. After a long moment, the door opened a crack, revealing a sliver of a pale, frightened face. Mary Spence was younger than Hamish had imagined, a girl with the pinched look of someone who had spent too many years counting other people's pennies while her own world crumbled. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she clutched a handkerchief as if it were a lifeline. "P.C. Macbeth," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Mrs. Gillespie said you might come. I told the other detectives everything I know. I truly did." Hamish gave her his most reassuring, vacuous smile, the one that usually prompted people to lower their guard. "I sure you did, Mary, but DCI Blair has a way of making people forget the small things, the quiet things, and in Lochdub, it's the quiet things that matter most." He stepped into the room, noting the open suitcase on the bed. It wasn't just packed, it was stuffed with the frantic haste of someone who didn't plan on looking back. But it wasn't the suitcase that caught his eye. It was a small, empty wicker basket in the corner, lined with a scrap of tartan wool. "You have a cat, Mary?" The girl's face crumbled, and she sat heavily on the edge of the bed. "I had a cat, Barnaby. He was all I had left of my mother. Sir Julian, he hated him. He said the animal was a menace to the grouse and a stain on the estate's dignity. 2 days ago, Barnaby went missing. I found him this morning, Hamish, behind the stables. He had been caught in one of those illegal snares Julian had ordered Geordie to set for the poachers. But it wasn't an accident. I saw Julian watching me from the study window, laughing. He wasn't even hiding it. He wanted to show me that he owned everything, even the things I loved." Hamish felt a cold, sharp anger settle in his gut, the kind of anger he usually reserved for men who kicked dogs or poisoned rivers. "A petty man," he said softly, "but a petty man who was also a desperate one, according to the books you were keeping for him." Mary looked up, her tears drying in the heat of her resentment. He wasn't just desperate, he was a fraud. His name wasn't even Julian Vane. He was Julian Stubbs, a disgraced solicitor from Manchester who vanished with a client's trust fund 5 years ago. Head spent years building this persona of the Sassenach Laird to lure in investors like Colonel Halberton Smythe. The Ardnish estate was bought with stolen money, and it was about to be repossessed. He was planning to vanish again, but this time, he was going to pin the embezzlement of the development funds on me. Head forged my signature on a dozen documents. I found them in his desk last night. The puzzle pieces in Hamish's mind began to click into place, but the image they formed was not the one Blair was chasing. This wasn't a crime of grand geopolitical conspiracy or land development greed. It was the inevitable explosion of a man whose arrogance had finally outweighed his intellect. Julian had been running because the law was closing in, but he had also been running from the person he tormented most. Yet, as Hamish looked at Mary's small, fragile hands, he knew she hadn't lifted that iron stag. She was the witness, but she wasn't the executioner. "He took your shoelaces, didn't he, Mary?" Hamish asked, his voice barely a whisper. She nodded slowly. "He didn't want me to leave. He knew I was going to the police in Strathbane this morning. He took my shoes and locked me in the laundry room at the manor. He told me I could watch him leave from the window, and that by the time I got out, I would be the most wanted woman in Scotland. I managed to climb through the coal chute, but I had no shoes. I had to run through the moor in my stockings. I didn't care about the cold. I just wanted to get away. And who helped you, Mary? You saw you running through the heather, with no shoes on your feet, and the rain in your face." Mary looked away, her silence more telling than any confession. Hamish realized then that the villain of the piece wasn't a stranger or a hidden assassin. It was someone who had been there all along, watching the village, listening to the gossip, and waiting for the moment when Julian's pettiness finally broke the Highland peace. It was someone who knew exactly how to use a length of blue nylon twine and a garden ornament to deliver a very local form of justice. The motive wasn't the millions of pounds or the stolen trust fund. It was a dead cat, a stolen pair of shoelaces, and the defense of a girl who had no one else to stand up for her. "It was Geordie, wasn't it?" Hamish said, though it wasn't really a question. He's always had a soft spot for Barnaby, and he's always hated men who don't pay their debts. Mary didn't answer, but the way she clutched the tartan wool from the cat's basket told him everything he needed to know. The hidden motive was as human and as small as a grudge in a Highland village, and the killer was a man who had simply decided that the world would be a better place without Julian Stubbs in it. Hamish stood up, his mind already working on how to protect the innocent while still seeing that justice of a sort was served. He had the why, and he had the who, but he still needed the how to convince Blair without sending an honest man to the gallows. He walked to the door, pausing to look back at the weeping girl and his long-suffering dog. "You stay here, Mary. Don't finish that packing just yet. I think you'll find that Lockdub is a very protective place when it needs to be." She stepped back into the cold, damp corridor, the weight of the truth sitting heavy in his pockets. He had to set a trap, and he had to do it before the sun rose and the great men from Strathbane returned to finish what they had started. The rain continued to fall, a grey shroud over the secrets of the glen, as Hamish Macbeth began to plan his final move in the gaying of the dead laird. Hamish stepped out of the hotel into a night that had grown even more treacherous, the wind now whipping off the loch with a ferocity that threatened to strip the very paint from the cottage doors. The rain was no longer a gentle hair, but a stinging spray that tasted of salt and ancient Highland earth. He adjusted his cap, pulling it low over his brow, and whistled for Lugs, who was currently huddling in the lee of a stone wall, looking as though he were contemplating a formal complaint to the animal welfare authorities. "It's a poor night for a walk, I'll grant you that," Hamish muttered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the water. "But a fine night for a man with a heavy conscience to go looking for what he's lost." He began to walk, not toward the station, but back toward the centre of the village, where the lights of the pub offered a deceptive warmth. He knew that in Lockdub, a secret told to the wind would travel faster than a telegram, but a secret whispered over a dram of whiskey was the fastest form of communication known to man. He pushed open the heavy oak doors of the Tommel Castle bar, the sudden blast of heat and the smell of stale tobacco and peat smoke hitting him like a physical blow. The room fell silent for a beat as the locals looked up, their eyes searching his face for news of the murder. Hamish didn't offer a word of greeting instead. He slumped toward the bar, looking every bit the defeated, incompetent policeman that DC farce Blair wished him to be. Angus, the barman, wiped a glass with a rag that had seen better centuries and poured a small measure of amber liquid without being asked. "Blair's been in a right state, Hamish," Angus grunted. "He's been shouting about arrests and rope. Is it true he's got Archie in the cells?" Hamish took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the heat of the whiskey settle in his throat before he answered. "Archie's gone home, Angus, but the inspector isn't finished. He's convinced it's a local job, though he's looking at the wrong kind of local. He's so busy with his ropes that he's missed the real prize." He lowered his voice, though he knew perfectly well that every ear in the room was strained in his direction. "The forensics boys from Strathbane are coming back at first light. It seems they found something wedged in the stone of the bridge, a pair of laces, they think, soaked in a very specific type of industrial lubricant, the kind they use in high-end garage hydraulics. They didn't have the right kit to bag it in this rain, so they've left it there, covered by a bit of tarp. Blair thinks it's the key to the whole thing." He saw the subtle shift in the room, a tightening of shoulders, a sudden interest in the bottom of glasses. Among the shadows in the corner, a figure moved slightly, the light catching the glint of a metal button on a heavy work jacket. Hamish didn't look directly at Geordie, but he felt the man's gaze like a physical weight. He finished his drink, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and let out a long, weary sigh. "I should be getting back. Shoo, I'm supposed to be guarding the bridge, but my old bones are crying out for the fire. If the rain keeps up like this, nobody's going to be wandering up to Ardnish tonight anyway. Even a murderer has enough sense to stay dry." He nodded to Angus, whistled for Lugs, and made a theatrical show of struggling with the heavy door as he exited back into the storm. Once outside, the mask of the lazy Bobby vanished. Hamish didn't head for his station. Instead, he circled back through the narrow alleys behind the harbour, moving with a silent, feline grace that would have astonished DC Thas Blair. He knew Geordie. The man was meticulous, a mechanic who prided himself on leaving a clean engine and a tidy workshop. The thought of a grease-stained clue sitting on that bridge, waiting for the Strathbane specialists, would be an itch he couldn't help but scratch. Geordie was not a professional killer. He was a man who had acted out of a sudden righteous fury for a girl and a cat, and such men always underestimated the persistence of the quiet ones. Hamish climbed the steep, slippery path toward the Ardnish boundary, his lungs burning with the cold air and the effort of the ascent. He didn't use a torch. He knew every rock and dip in the path by heart. By the time he reached the bridge, the world was a cacophony of rushing water and whistling wind. The iron stag had been removed, leaving only a dark, jagged scar on the landscape where the earth had been torn up. Hamish found a hollow beneath a cluster of ancient, twisted rowan trees that offered a small measure of shelter and a clear view of the bridge. He settled down, Lugs pressing close to his side for warmth. and began the long, cold wait. He knew the psychology of the Highland criminal better than any textbook. It wasn't the fear of the law that brought them back to the scene. It was the fear of being seen as sloppy. In a land where a man's reputation was his only currency, the idea of leaving a signature of his trade at a murder site was intolerable. Minutes turned into an hour, the rain soaking through his layers until he felt the chill deep in his marrow. He thought about Mary Spence and the dead cat, Barnaby. He thought about Sir Julian, a man who had built a life on shadows and had been ended by a shadow of his own making. Then, through the grey veil of the storm, he saw it a flicker of movement near the bridge. A dark figure appeared, searching. Hamish rose, ready to face the truth and the man who had sought his own justice. Yes, the trap was truly set, and the killer was finally here. The figure on the bridge was little more than a smudge of deeper blackness against the shifting charcoal of the storm, but the erratic beam of a small torch betrayed his presence. He was on his hands and knees, clawing at the sodden tarp that the forensics team, which existed only in the fertile imagination of Hamish Macbeth, had supposedly left behind. The man's movements were frantic, the actions of a person who had spent a lifetime being careful, and had suddenly realized he had left a fingerprint on the throat of the world. Lugs let out a low, vibrating growl that was swallowed by the roar of the swollen burn below, and Hamish placed a calming hand on the dog's wet fur. He stood up slowly, the joints in his long legs protesting the damp chill, and stepped out from the shelter of the rowan trees. The torch beam jerked upward, cutting through the rain like a white blade, before settling on Hamish's face. He looked, as he always did, like a man who had wandered into the wrong century. His red hair plastered to his forehead, and his eyes squinting against the glare with an expression of mild, sleepy curiosity. "It's a poor night for gardening, Geordie," Hamish said, his voice carrying with surprising clarity over the gale, "especially on a bridge that's been closed by the police. I didn't think you were the type for trespassing on a laird's land. But then, the laird isn't in much of a position to complain anymore, is he?" Geordie froze, the torch trembling in his hand. He was a broad-shouldered man, built like the engines he spent his days repairing, his strength forged in the heavy iron and grease of the locked-up garage. He didn't speak at first, his breath hitching in his chest, a visible cloud in the torchlight. I left a wrench," Geordie finally croaked, his voice thick with the desperation of a man who knew the ground was opening up beneath him. "I was up here earlier, helping the boys move the stag. I thought I dropped a socket." Hamish took a step closer, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets. He looked remarkably relaxed for a man standing on a slippery precipice with a potential murderer. "A socket, Geordie. Or perhaps a pair of silk laces soaked in the very same hydraulic fluid you used to bleed the brakes on the Colonel's Volvo. It's a tidy thought, coming back to clean up. But there are no laces, Geordie. There never were. I made them up while I was having a dram at the pub. I knew that if the man who tipped that stag was a man of precision, a man who hated a messy job, he wouldn't be able to sleep, knowing there was a signature of his trade left behind for the Strathbane men to find." Torch beam dropped to the ground, illuminating the muddy boots of a man who had run out of lies. Geordie slumped, the air leaving his lungs in a long, shuddering sob that was more of a moan. "He killed the cat, Hamish." He laughed at her. "Mary was running through the heather in her stockings, her feet bleeding, because that devil had taken her shoes to keep her prisoner. He treated us all like dirt under his handmade brogues. I saw her crying by the road, and I saw him on the bridge, looking down like he was the king of the Highlands. I didn't plan it. The stag was already loose from the renovations. I had the twine in my pocket. I had the grease. It was so easy, Hamish. It was like the hand of God was pushing that iron beast over the edge. The hand of God doesn't usually use blue nylon twine, Geordie," Hamish said softly, his voice devoid of judgment but heavy with the weight of the law. "And it doesn't leave a girl like Mary to carry the weight of a secret like that. You thought you were protecting her, but you've only given her a different kind of prison. Now, I want you to put the torch down and come away from the edge. DC Vi's a man who loves a violent struggle, and I'd rather not give him the satisfaction of seeing me with a black eye." But Geordie's desperation had reached its boiling point. The realization that his life, his garage, and his quiet existence in the village were over sparked a frantic, animal panic. He didn't put the torch down, he lunged. He was a powerful man, and the force of his charge caught Hamish off guard on the slick, greasy stones of the bridge. They went down together in a tangle of limbs and wet wool, sliding toward the low parapet. Hamish, for all his deceptive laziness, possessed the wiry, deceptive strength of a Highland shepherd. He twisted in Geordie's grip, his long fingers locking onto the man's wrists with the strength of a gin trap. They wrestled in the mud, the torch spinning away and casting wild, dizzying shadows across the stone arches. Geordie was gasping, his face contorted with a mix of rage and terror. But Hamish remained eerily calm, his movements precise and economical. He used the man's own momentum against him, pivoting on one heel and pinning Geordie's arm behind his back in a maneuver that was far more professional than anything DC Vi Blair would have expected from a useless peasant. With a grunt of effort, Hamish forced Geordie face down into the mud, his knee pressing firmly into the small of the man's back. "Enough, Geordie," Hamish panted, the rain lashing his face. "It's over. You've done enough damage for one day. Lugs, stay." The dog was hovering at the edge of the scuffle, his hackles raised and a low, menacing snarl vibrating in his throat. Geordie stopped struggling, his forehead pressed into the cold, wet earth. The fight had drained out of him as quickly as it had begun, leaving only the hollow shell of a man who had tried to do a right thing in a very wrong way. Hamish reached into his pocket and produced a pair of heavy steel handcuffs, a piece of equipment he usually kept buried under a pile of old newspapers in the station. The metallic clack as they locked around Geordie's wrists seemed to signal the final end of the Ardnish mystery. Hamish stood up, pulling the shivering mechanic to his feet. He looked out over the loch, where the first faint hint of a grey dawn was beginning to bleed into the horizon. She felt no triumph, only a weary sadness for a village that had lost its peace and a man who had lost his soul to a metal stag. "Come on then," Hamish said, his voice returning to its familiar, gentle lilt. "Let's get you back to the station. I have a pot of coffee that's been waiting far too long, and I suspect we both need something to wash the taste of this night away." He led the prisoner down the path, the lanky policeman and the broken mechanic disappearing into the mist, while Lugs followed behind, finally satisfied that the world had returned to its proper, albeit messy, order. The trek back from the Ardnish Bridge was a somber procession through a world waking to a slate-grey reality. The wind had dropped to a sullen whisper, but the air was so thick it felt like walking through the loch itself. Geordie walked with the heavy, dragging steps of a man whose future had evaporated into the Highland mist, his cuffed hands tucked into his oil-stained sleeves. Hamish followed a step behind, Lugs bringing up the rear with a solemnity that suggested the dog understood the gravity of the betrayal. As they reached Lochstub, the first plumes of peat smoke rose from chimneys, a domestic peace jarringly at odds with the night. When they reached the station, Hamish saw DC Verse through the window, slumped over the pine table in an exhausted slumber. Hamish paused, smoothing his chaotic red hair. He needed to look like a man who had stumbled upon a miracle. He nudged Geordie forward, the metallic clink of handcuffs acting as a more effective alarm than any bell. Blair jerked awake, his head snapping up with a snort that sent cold coffee across the reports he had used as a pillow. His eyes were bloodshot, his tie loosened, and his face the colour of a bruised plum. "Macbeth!" she roared, though the sound was muffled by a yawn. "Where have you been?" "I've been sitting in this draughty hovel while you've been playing at being a mountain goat. And who's this? What have you brought me now? A local drunk?" Blair stood up, his joints popping, and stomped toward them, his gaze falling on the handcuffs. Hamish adopted an expression of wide-eyed admiration, the kind reserved for village idiots. "Oh, Inspector, it was just as you said. I can hardly believe the sharpness of your mind. I was thinking about what you told me about how the killer must be someone with technical knowledge and the strength of a bull. You were so right when you mentioned the garage hydraulics earlier. It stayed with me. It bothered my soul until I couldn't sit still." Blair blinked, his small, suspicious eyes darting between Hamish and the cowering Geordie. I did mention the hydraulics, did I?" he muttered, his chest beginning to puff out with the pride of a man who loved being credited with ideas he hadn't actually had. "Aye, sir. You did, you said, Macbeth. Look to the man who knows the weight of iron, and so I went to the bridge, just to check on that bit of twine you'd pointed out, and there he was. Geordie was trying to hide the evidence, just like you predicted. He was trying to dispose of the missing shoelaces from Sir Julian's guest. The laces you noted were absent. I merely had to step out and tell him that DC-5 Blair was on his way, and the man just gave up. He knew he couldn't outrun a man of your experience." Geordie looked up, a flicker of confusion crossing his face, but a sharp, silent look from Hamish, a momentary hardening of the ice told him to keep his mouth shut. Geordie slumped, nodding slowly. "He's right," the mechanic muttered. Knew the big man from Strathbane would see through me eventually. I just wanted it over with." Blair let out a short, triumphant bark of laughter, his exhaustion vanishing. He clapped a heavy, moist hand on Hamish's shoulder, nearly knocking the lanky constable over.
Well, well!
It's about time you started paying attention to my instructions, Macbeth. I knew it was the mechanic the moment I saw that garden ornament. It took a professional eye to see the mechanical precision of the drop and the shoelaces. Yes, I remember thinking they were the key. You did well enough to follow my lead. I'll handle the interrogation from here. Anderson, get in here and get this man into the car. As Anderson scurried to take custody of the prisoner, Blair paced the room, his mind already composing headlines for the Strathbane Gazette. DC Furs, Blair solves Highland murder with forensic insight, he muttered, his fingers drumming his belt. Yes, it's a good result. I might even mention your assistance in the footnotes, Macbeth. Though I suspect the chief constable will see who did the real heavy lifting. Oh, I would not want to trouble the chief constable with my name, sir, Hamish said, looking at his boots with feigned humility. I was just the boots on the ground, following the map you laid out. In fact, if you're writing the report, perhaps it's best if my name is left out entirely. I'd hate for people to think I was trying to steal glory from a man of your stature. It might look like I was looking for a promotion, and we both know I'm not built for city life. I'd just be a burden to you in Strathbane. Blair stopped pacing and looked at Hamish with rare approval. You're a lazy, shiftless peasant, Macbeth, but you have a modicum of common sense. You're right. You'd be a disaster in a real precinct. Best you stay here and keep the sheep in line. I'll make sure the report reflects the truth, that I directed the operation from the start and oversaw the final apprehension. Thank you, sir, Hamish said, his voice smooth as cream. You're a very generous man. He watched through the window as the Strathbane cars pulled away, the blue lights flashing briefly against the grey Highland morning before disappearing around the bend of the loch. The station was quiet again, the only sound the ticking of the clock and the soft snoring of Lugs, who had returned to his spot by the stove. Hamish sighed, a deep sound of relief. He was still in Lochdub. He was still a village bobby with a hole in his sweater. The credit had gone where it was most useful to a man whose vanity acted as a shield for Hamish's peaceful life. He walked to the cupboard, pulled out the coffee tin, and began to measure the grounds. The case of the dead laird was closed, and more importantly, the case of Hamish Macbeth's career was safely stalled for another season. He looked at the empty chair, where Geordie had sat, and felt a twinge of regret. But in the Highlands, justice was as messy as the mud. He had protected the village, the girl, and his own solitude. He told the dog it was a grand morning for doing absolutely nothing at all. The kettle began to hum, a friendly sound signalling the return of the world he loved, far from the reach of the great men and their loud, red-faced ambitions. The steam rose from the blue mug, a fragrant ghost that seemed to finally exorcise the lingering scent of DC Thas, Blair's cheap tobacco, and the cold, metallic tang of the night at the bridge. Hamish Macbeth sat in his sagging armchair, his long, lanky frame stretched toward the stove, watching the peat embers pulse with a deep inner glow. The morning light was no longer the bruised grey of the storm, but a pale, watery gold that filtered through the window, illuminating the dust motes and the chaotic, red thicket of his hair. Lugs was asleep at his feet, his paws twitching in a dream that likely involved chasing a very large, very slow-moving salmon. The silence of the station was absolute, a heavy, comfortable blanket that had been absent for far too long. To the outside world, PC Macbeth was merely a village bobby who had somehow managed to assist a brilliant detective from Strathbane. To the people of Lochdub, however, the silence was a shared understanding. They knew that the useless policeman had once again protected their own, and in the Highlands, that was the only currency that truly mattered. Lochdub had a way of healing its own wounds. The death of a laird was already becoming a local legend, a story to be told over pints in the bar of the Tommel Castle Hotel. He thought of Geordie. The garage remained closed, a heavy padlock on the rusted gate, but word had already gone round the village that a collection was being taken for Geordie's mother. The village wouldn't let her suffer. They understood that Geordie had acted from a sense of justice that the law didn't always recognise. Even Mrs. Wellington at the post office had been seen wiping a stray tear from her eye as she sorted the morning mail, though she quickly replaced it with her usual expression of sour disapproval when a group of hikers asked for directions. Highland Laird was gone, his silver Bentley towed away by a company from the south, and the Ardnish estate was back in the hands of the banks. The threat of wind turbines had vanished with Julian Stubbs' fabricated identity. It was as if a dark foreign cloud had been blown out to sea, leaving the glen exactly as it had been for centuries. Priscilla Halberton-Smythe arrived just as Hamish was contemplating a second pot of coffee. She didn't knock, she simply walked in, her presence bringing a hint of expensive perfume that briefly battled with the smell of damp dog and wood smoke. She looked at him for a long moment, her cool blue eyes searching his face for a flicker of the man who had wrestled a killer on a slippery bridge. But Hamish only gave her a vacant, slightly puzzled smile, the mask of the simple village bobby firmly back in place. "It's a grand day for a walk, Priscilla," he said, his voice a lazy Highland drawl. "I was just thinking about checking the river. I heard the water is high enough for a bit of sport." "I saw the papers, Hamish," she said, ignoring his talk of the river. "DCI Blair is being hailed as a visionary in the Strathbane Gazette. They say his unparalleled intuition led him straight to the culprit. My father even sent him a formal letter of commendation. He's quite convinced that you were nothing more than a glorified tour guide during the whole affair." She stepped closer, her expression softening into something like genuine pity. "Why do you do it, Hamish? Why let a man like that take the credit for your work? You could be a sergeant in Inverness by now. You could have a real career instead of living in a kitchen with a dog that smells like a wet carpet." Hamish sighed, a sound that held the weight of his chosen solitude. "A sergeant in Inverness has to wear a stiff tie every day, Priscilla. He has to sit in endless meetings and look at spreadsheets and answer to men who care more about statistics than they do about the people living in the glens. In Lochdub, I know which tree the golden eagle nests in. I know which side of the loch the fish are biting on. And I know that if I were a hero, I'd be a hero somewhere else. I like it here. I like the rain, and I like the silence. And I especially like that DCI Blair thinks I'm too stupid to be a threat to his promotion." "You're the smartest man I know, and also the most infuriating," Priscilla replied, though there was a hint of a smile on her lips. She reached out and brushed a stray bit of peat ash from his shoulder. "Mary Spence left this morning. She's going to live with an aunt in Edinburgh. She asked me to give you this." She handed him a small folded note. Inside, in a neat, trembling hand, were the words, "Thank you for the shoes." Beneath the note was a single silver button, one that would fit perfectly on the gap in his uniform tunic. After Priscilla left, the station returned to its quiet rhythm. Hamish stood by the stove, sewing the silver button onto his tunic with the clumsy, slow precision of a man who had all the time in the world. He thought about the iron stag, now lying in a police warehouse, and the private signs that would eventually rot in the Highland mud. The world outside Lochdub was always moving too fast, chasing money and titles, and a version of progress that didn't understand the soul of the mountains. He was happy to stay behind the veil of the mist. He looked at Lugs, who had finally woken up and was staring expectantly at the cupboard where the biscuits were kept. I know, Hamish muttered. "Job well done deserves a reward, doesn't it?" He reached for a biscuit, then decided on two. Life was returning to its proper order. There would be gossip at the pub tonight, and Archie McLean would likely try to sell him a poached salmon by tomorrow afternoon. The lazy PC Macbeth would be there to ignore the crime, to drink the tea, and to listen to the things people didn't say. He felt the warmth of the stove on his back and the quiet weight of the silver button on his chest. He was exactly where he wanted to be, and as long as the world believed he was a fool, he would be free to remain the smartest man in the glen. He took a final sip of his coffee, found it was still hot, and smiled. It was indeed a grand day for doing nothing at all. The week that followed the arrest of Geordie was a time of peculiar stillness in Lochdub, as if the village itself were holding its breath, waiting for the final ripples of the Ardnish tragedy to settle beneath the dark surface of the loch. The frantic activity of the Strathbane detectives had become a fading memory, replaced by the familiar, slow-motion choreography of Highland life. Hamish Macbeth stood on the pier, his hands tucked deep into his pockets, watching the morning mist weave through the masts of the fishing boats. The air was crisp, tasting of salt and the first faint promise of winter, and the mountains stood like ancient sentinels, indifferent to the petty dramas of men. In the village, life had already begun to turn its back on the memory of Sir Julian Vane, or whatever his real name had been. To the locals, he had been a fever dream, a loud and unpleasant intrusion that had been corrected by the land itself. Hamish felt a strange, hollow sense of peace. She had saved the village from the wind turbines and the fraud, but he had lost a neighbour to the cold iron of the law. It was the kind of trade Hamish made often, and it never became any easier to stomach. He turned away from the water and began the walk toward the post office, Lugs trotting at his heels with an air of renewed purpose. The dog seemed to sense that the danger had passed, his tail wagging with a rhythmic enthusiasm that suggested he was ready for a biscuit. As they passed the Tommel Castle Hotel, Hamish saw Mrs. Gillespie, shaking out a rug with enough force to suggest she was personally punishing the dust. She caught his eye and gave a sharp, decisive nod of approval that was worth more than a dozen medals from the chief constable. "The tea is fresh, Macbeth," she called out, her voice a gravelly rasp. "And there's a plate of scones that didn't quite make it to the dining room. I expect you'll be needing them if you're planning on doing any more detecting today." Hamish smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth to touch his face in days. "I retired from the detecting business for the season, Mrs. Gillespie," he replied. "I'm back to being a man of leisure and a part-time policeman, just as nature intended." Inside the post office, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of floor wax and the low murmur of Mrs. Wellington's voice as she scrutinized a parcel. The conversation stopped abruptly when Hamish entered, every head turning with a look of collective expectation. They wanted to know about Geordie, about the trial, and about whether DCI Blair really was as stupid as he looked on the television news. Hamish simply leaned against the counter, adopting an expression of mild confusion. "Tragic business, surely," he said, shaking his head. "It's a good thing the inspector from Strathbane was here to see the things I missed. I would have probably arrested the minister's cat if left to my own devices." A ripple of knowing laughter went through the room. They didn't believe him, of course, but they respected the lie. It was a comfortable arrangement that allowed everyone to return to their business without the burden of gratitude. Hamish collected his mallar bill for the electricity and a catalogue for fishing tackle and made his way back out into the pale Highland sun. The path back to the station led him past the Ardenish boundary, where the private signs were already beginning to tilt and peel in the damp air. The estate felt empty now, a hollow shell of a manor house waiting for the next owner to come and try their luck against the isolation of the glen. Hamish stopped at the bridge, looking down into the shallow ditch where Julian had fallen. The grass was already growing over the churned mud, and the iron stag had been replaced by a quiet stand of rowan trees. He thought of Mary Spence, now safe in Edinburgh, and wondered if she still dreamed of the moor. He reached into his pocket and felt the silver button he had sewn onto his tunic. It was a small thing, but it was a tether to the people he served. He wasn't just a policeman, he was the keeper of the village's conscience. A role that required him to be both the fool and the guardian. It was a lonely job, but as he looked at the purple heather and the silver thread of the river, he knew he wouldn't trade it for all the promotions in Scotland. Back at the station, the kettle was already beginning to hum on the stove, a sound that Hamish found more comforting than any music. He settled into his armchair, the old springs groaning in welcome, and watched lugs collapse onto the rug with a sigh of absolute contentment. The morning's post remained unopened on the table. It could wait until the afternoon, or perhaps until next Tuesday. There was a sense of profound rightness in the world, a realization that the chaos of the last week had been nothing more than a passing storm. He thought of DC Far's Blair, likely sitting in a grey office in Strathbane, shouting at a subordinate while basking in the glow of a stolen arrest. Blair had the credit, the headlines, and the promise of a higher rank, but Hamish had the loch, the fire, and the respect of people who knew how to keep a secret. It was a lopsided bargain, and Hamish was the one who had come out ahead. He closed his eyes, the warmth of the room lulling him into a gentle doze, his mind drifting toward the river. He imagined the salmon moving through the dark, peat-stained waters, their silver scales catching the light as they leapt toward the spawning grounds. Tonight, he would go down to the black pool with his net and his quiet footsteps, reclaiming a bit of the land that the Laird had tried to steal. It was his ritual of belonging, a way of reminding the Highlands that he was still there, watching and waiting. The crime was solved, the outsider was gone, and the village of Lochstub had returned to its ancient, unhurried rhythm. Hamish Macbeth was a man of the mountains, a man of the mist. And as long as there were secrets to be kept and salmon to be poached, he would be exactly where he belonged. He reached out a hand and ruffled Lug's ears, the dog letting out a sleepy whimper of affection. The fire crackled, a small spark jumping from the peat and dying on the hearth, and Hamish Macbeth, the laziest and smartest policeman in the north, finally allowed himself to drift into a deep and well-earned sleep. The Highlands remained, as they always did, silent, beautiful, and utterly indifferent to the world beyond the glen.